For survivors, domestic violence represents trauma in crisis. There's a need for rapid, short-term response, but also a longer process of healing, which could even include education and training and help with housing. And this is especially going for women from marginalized communities. To tell us about new efforts to meet those needs are two guests from the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, shelter and community advocate Vanessa Cordero, and housing and family advocate Anna Borroz. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
I want to start with Vanessa, because when we say domestic violence, we think of that as something just physical, but mentally, what happens to somebody who's a survivor?
Yeah, so survivors often experience emotional abuse, financial abuse, things like gaslighting, people kind of trying to make you feel like your reality isn't the reality that you know, taking you away from financial resources. There's so much more than just physical violence that people often associate with domestic violence.
Anna, you help survivors relocate. That makes it sound easy, I guess, but with this housing market that we have on, what do you have to do for people?
It can be a challenge. A lot of my job involves setting people up to be in a place where they can get housing, because a lot of in Boston, you have to have a pretty good credit score and you have to have references and, lots of these kind of background steps before getting an apartment is actually a realistic option for many people. So a lot of what I do is kind of supporting with those background things and like connecting people to resources to maybe fix their credit or to pay off, back rent, or if they have maybe an issue on their background check. If they were ever involved in any criminal activity in the past, that can really affect somebody's ability to get housing. So it's a surprising amount of the work that I do is not directly housing. It's kind of the support and background stuff that comes before.
Vanessa, another thing that you're concerned with here is making sure you meet all the different kinds of needs in different communities in Boston. Yes. This could be people of color, it could be LGBT populations. What about their needs?
Yeah, so that's a really, really great point. So because of societal oppression, in general, LGBTQ people might experience homophobia, people of color might experience racism, and so part of my job is looking at how does all of this exacerbate abuse and make it harder for survivors in those communities to get support?
Well, talk about it a little bit more. People of color, it could also, I guess, mean immigrant communities where there's a different culture around domestic violence. What could that mean?
Yeah, I guess that depends on the community, but definitely sometimes with, whatever cultural background you might have, maybe abuse isn't as talked about as it might be in some other cultural communities. It's really different for everybody. And so part of my job as well is being culturally aware and just like listening to somebody's experience and just taking everything the whole person into account when working with them.
And I know over a certain amount of time you're successful at helping a lot of people, but I imagine there must be these intervals where somebody who's a survivor is going to one place after another and not lucking out. What happens?
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the issues that we tend to run into a lot, is that survivors kind of bounce around from service to service because Boston is very service rich. We have a lot of supports available for people, but a big problem we run into is these organizations don't necessarily communicate with each other. And so we'll have people who kind of started with, one organization, but kind of fell off the wagon because maybe their abuse escalated again and they, had to drop out of the program that they were in, and then they end up in a different shelter. And so there's a lot of moving around and a lot of chaos that comes as part of being a survivor of abuse.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Vanessa Cordero and Anna Borroz from Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. Vanessa, what about that? Because some of these programs in shelters, they are meant to help people. It's better than being stuck where the abuse was taking place. But I guess, if you're staying in a shelter, that's not easy, isn't it?
It's really hard to be in shelter. Yeah, I think sometimes especially folks maybe just starting out in this work, that's kind of the first thing everybody realizes is it's hard for our families to be in shelter, They don't necessarily want to be in shelter, completely understandably, so that's always a challenge.
And housing for survivors, I imagine this isn't just a place to stay. I mean, if I do the analogy with people in recovery from substance abuse, for example, having a place to live, it stabilizes them. This is what also goes on with survivors of domestic violence?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. It's incredible how important it ends up being just to have a safe place to come home to at night, and being able to offer that shelter to survivors is like, it helps create the start of a really good foundation so that they can kind of rebuild their lives from, zero, basically.
And speaking of other services, these are people who are simultaneously maybe looking for a new job. And,
right.
So if you don't have a place to live,
right.
how are you going to get hired?
Because the reality of abuse is that it affects the whole person, your body, your spirit, your emotions, and so, if we run into a lot of problems with survivors because, when your whole person is broken down because of the abuse you've been experiencing, you won't have the confidence to go do well in a job interview. You won't have the confidence to, maybe even go out and look for a job in the first place. And so that's actually one of the other programs that the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry offers, is a job readiness program that is specifically designed to be good for survivors of trauma. And so they start every morning with mindfulness and yoga. They have an art therapist who comes in, because we sort of realized in the creation of this program that if you don't address the whole person and you don't fix the spirit of the person as well, that you don't really set them up for success. And it really, the tangible things like a job and an education and a house and all that, like those are all very important. But if you don't have the strength within yourself, to hold that stuff together, you won't, it won't matter. So that's one of the things that we really try to address.
Vanessa, we don't automatically associate domestic abuse with sexual abuse, but with all the attention to the Me Too movement over the past couple of years, does that change the complexion of things for you when you look at domestic violence?
It's interesting because domestic violence, so the Me Too movement has garnered a lot of support, but people still aren't talking about domestic violence in the same way as sexual assault. But it's interesting because sexual assault and domestic violence really can often go hand in hand.
And finally, Vanessa, if people want some more help with any part of the spectrum here, is there some way they can follow up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so our shelter that we work at, Renewal House, we have a 24-hour crisis hotline. Our phone number is 617-566-6881. So, if folks are experiencing domestic violence, they can call us. If they know somebody who's experiencing domestic violence, if you're triggered by the news can be really triggering. And if you want to talk about any of the domestic violence or sexual assault related things that, we've been seeing on the news, we're also a great place to call.
Thank you both very much for being with us. Vanessa Cordero and Anna Borroz.